And now, without further ado, the main event for our convocation, David Quammen.
Thank you very much, President Snyder. Thank you all for welcoming me. My thanks to the Common Reading Committee and to the Ad Hoc Committee, to the deans, provost, staff, faculty, board of Case Western Reserve, and to the students and alum who are here. It's really very nice to be here in Cleveland at Case Western Reserve. I only wish Charles Darwin were with us also. And it's especially nice to be here as part of such a menu of intellectual fare that you have for this forthcoming year. I've seen it today, the list of other speakers that you'll have coming in coming weeks and months, and I really envy you, the people that you're going to get to hear and interact with during this year at Case. Francis Collins, I gather, in a week. Sean Carroll, a wonderfully interesting biologist. Not long after that, Edward Larson, the historian. I think Ed Wilson will be here, and a number of others. By all means, I enjoy these people. Especially, I shouldn't say especially, but Sean Carroll is a really fascinating biologist. You should come and hear him. Now, let's see. So, what I want to talk about this afternoon is the character of Charles Darwin and the way his character affected the development and the presentation of his single most important idea. Excuse me while I get my reading glasses on. Now, that idea, of course, is evolution by natural selection. And if you've read my little book, and probably whether or not you've read it, you know the essence of that idea and a bit about how Darwin found it and shaped it. In case you don't, very, very sparely, I'll say natural selection encompasses three essential ideas. First of all, more individuals are born to every species in every generation than can survive given the limited resources of food and habitat. Secondly, those individuals vary from one to another within a given species. Third, only the fittest of them therefore survive and reproduce. And the result of those three factors working together leads to evolutionary change and adaptation. That's the idea. Today, I want to try to place that idea more vividly for you within its human context. The context of Darwin the person, Darwin the husband and father, Darwin the painstaking, shy Englishman who lived within a certain social milieu and a certain time. I want to focus on something that I treated only passingly in the book. I want us to think together about two particular traits of his character, which help illuminate the story behind his great discovery and his announcement of it to the world. Those traits are caution and honesty. Charles Darwin had unusual quantities of both. Caution. Why did he wait 21 years between the discovery and the announcement? He was just 29 years old in autumn of 1838 when the concept of evolution by natural selection came to him. 29. He was 50 years old in 1859 when he published On the Origin of Species. That was 21 years of preparation, hard labor, revision, distraction, and delay. Where did the time go? Was he worried? What was he worried about? Why was he unwilling or unready to publish sooner? Caution. But the caution was tempered with an especially strong strain of honesty. What pushed him forward during those 21 years? There was something besides scientific curiosity and ambition. What guided him through the uncertain times, some of which were pretty lonely and miserable? What prevented him from cutting corners intellectually? What drove him to examine the idea of natural selection more critically than even his critics eventually would? What forced him to publish it finally, despite all the discomfort he knew it would cause to his family and all the outrage he knew it would stir up? The answer, I think, is his rock-ribbed congenital honesty. He had arrived at what he considered an important truth. He couldn't not speak it. Now, Charles Darwin wasn't always a heroically honest man. There's that one notable exception, which I mention in the book, his handling of the co-discovery with Alfred Russel Wallace. Alfred Wallace was this unknown young collector out in the Malay archipelago, what we now think of as Indonesia, 14 years younger than Darwin, who, during the long years of delay, Darwin's delay, went looking for an evolutionary theory himself, and Wallace found it. That is, he hit upon the very same big idea that Darwin had been nurturing secretly. So he wrote that famous letter to Darwin containing a short manuscript. Why send it to Darwin? Well, because Darwin happened to be one of the very few well-connected scientists that Wallace even knew. So he wrote, "Dear Mr. Darwin, I've got this wild idea. What do you think about it?" And there it was, evolution by natural selection. Wallace didn't use those exact words, but he had the essence. Darwin was devastated. His first reaction was despair. Well, there goes all my originality, all my credit for this monumental discovery. Scientific priority was important in those days as it is today. Darwin hated himself for caring about priority, but he did care. He complained by letter to two of his powerful friends, Charles Lyell and Joseph Hooker, until they stepped in and rescued him by arranging a joint announcement, Darwin and Wallace on evolution. Later, Darwin even lied to himself. Maybe lie is too strong a word. At very least, fibbed to himself and to others about how his powerful friends came to create that arrangement. He told Wallace by letter that, quote, "I had absolutely nothing whatever to do with leading Lyell and Hooker to what they thought a fair course of action." Right. So, he was not always a heroically honest man. But he was almost always a heroically honest man. And that's part of what made him extraordinary. Now, both this honesty and the caution showed early in Darwin's intellectual life, during the period back in London just after the voyage of the Beagle. 2 years. That's when he was brainstorming his way toward an evolutionary theory by scribbling in what he called his transmutation notebooks. These notebooks were little leather-bound pads, not much bigger than that. They'd fit in a jacket pocket. They've survived and been published. They're fascinating and they're valuable because they show the course of his thought as it was taking shape. In the first notebook, the very first, he reminded himself that every species contains variation, as I said, variation among individuals. Children don't look exactly like their siblings unless they're identical twins. Each cat differs slightly from other cats, each dog from other dogs. Darwin outlined a thought experiment. Put a pair of cats on an island, let them breed there and multiply for many generations, Then compare the offspring to mainland cats. He wrote, "Who will dare say what result?" He would dare eventually. 10 pages later, he wrote, "Each species changes. Does it progress?" Darwin himself was progressing toward the big idea. He wrote, "Changes not result of will of animal, but law of adaptation." A law of adaptation, okay. But what was the law? He wrote, "Organized beings represent a tree. The limbs," now me speaking, "the limbs and small branches of that tree stand for living species. The trunk is extinct species, common ancestors from which all the rest have grown." 10 pages further in the notebook, he drew a tree-like diagram showing the ends of the branches labeled with letters, A, B, C, D. Because of the irregular limb structure, branch A was way out to the right, branches B and C were closer to each other on the left. He wrote, "Thus genera would be formed. That is, B and C are two species within a single genus, whereas A belongs to a different genus." So this was not just a diagram showing the origin of species. It showed the origin of genera, orders, whole classes of creatures, fish, mammals, reptiles, birds. It showed the origin of biological diversity. He noted the big gap between birds and mammals. Here was a way to account for it. And not just that gap, but even bigger ones, between vertebrates and insects, between animals and plants. He wrote, "All coming from one stock and obeying one law." Now he was getting excited. On the next page of the notebook, he caught himself. He wrote, "Heaven knows whether this agrees with nature. Cuidado." A warning to himself. Cuidado. He'd spent enough time in South America during the Beagle voyage to know the Spanish word for caution. He forged on, making these notebooks a shorthand record of his reading, his evidence, his thinking and wondering. Why do men have nipples? Darwin, restless thinker, wanted to know. Why do flightless species of beetle live on windy islands, and why do those beetles possess perfectly good wings sealed uselessly within sealed wing covers? How could you reconcile such oddities with the Orthodox Christian account of creation? Each species, shaped directly by God, one by one, in acts of special creation. Maybe that Orthodox account could be stretched by ingenious theologians to cover such oddities, but there was a better, more economical, more persuasive answer. Namely, that flightless beetles on islands reflect some sort of transmutation from ancestral beetles that flew. Once you grant that species transmutate from one into another, Darwin wrote, the whole fabric totters and falls. And that fabric was the old orthodoxy about special creations. This brought him to the most scary and difficult question of all. What about humans? He wrote, but man, wonderful man, is an exception. Man is godlike, yes? Wait a minute, no. Man is clearly a mammal. Instincts, nipples, canine teeth, belly button. Just a few lines below the first sentence, Darwin reversed himself. No, man is no exception. That is, humans are no more godlike than any other species. And from that terrible insight, that moment of blazing conviction, he would never retreat. Emma Darwin, his wife, is an important figure in this discussion because she was a source of his caution and a challenge to his honesty. She was his first cousin, before she became his wife. He proposed to her at almost exactly the same time as he was conceiving his big theory, late autumn 1838. At that point, he was brimming with intellectual excitement, and he had no one to share it with. He was also overworked, nervous, and he had begun suffering from a mystery illness that would punish him intermittently for most of his life. Heart palpitations, headaches, vomiting. Starting around this time, Charles Darwin probably vomited more than any great scientist in history. Altogether, he'd had enough of his bachelor life. He was ready to get married, but he hadn't yet decided to whom. Being cautious again, he worked through the question of marriage as though it were an arithmetic problem. I mentioned in the book that weirdly systematic process with him listing the pros and cons of marriage on a sheet of paper. For those of you who haven't read it, he actually wrote that marriage would give him a companion in old age who'd be better than a dog anyhow. He wrote, "Only picture to yourself a nice, soft wife on a sofa with good fire and books and music, perhaps." What a romantic. Suddenly then, at this time of tension and excitement and anxiety, he reached out to his cousin, Emma, whom he'd known all her life, and asked her to marry him. I see Darwin's choice of Emma in paradoxical terms, as a reckless leap toward safety. In other words, even this seemingly incautious act was really very cautious. Once Emma had accepted his proposal, he swung back from ambivalent caution to heedless honesty. He sat her down for a talk about religious beliefs. This was literally heedless because his own father, the obese and imposing Dr. Robert Darwin, his own father had specifically advised him against doing any such thing. According to Dr. Robert, a man should carefully conceal any religious doubts from his wife. The reason being that candor on that subject would only cause unhappiness in the long run. Charles promptly ignored his father's advice and opened up the subject to Emma. She was intelligent, pious, and conventional. Darwin told her something about the shape of his current thinking. We don't know exactly what, and his doubts about Christianity. Our evidence for this conversation is a letter that she wrote, thanking him for his candor, but admitting that the difference in views between him and her would be a painful void between us. Now, their marriage worked out surprisingly well, especially given these inauspicious beginnings. It lasted 43 years to the end of his life, becoming only more solid as time passed. The painful void that Emma had mentioned was no illusion, and it never went away. Darwin was always aware that his rejection of religion and his materialistic theory of origins, and especially of human origins, were deeply troubling to the one person he loved most. That awareness of Emma's feelings probably contributed to the 21-year delay in publishing his theory. Eventually, he went ahead anyway. Love was important to him, so was simple human consideration, but ultimately science and honesty were more important. Two other events during the early years contributed to his scientific caution. The first involved a geological mystery known as the parallel roads of Glenroy. These parallel roads were natural horizontal terraces along the mountain slopes above a river valley, a glen, the glen of the River Roy in western Scotland. And the mystery was, what had created them? They were very flat, very smooth, very strange. Darwin visited Glenroy during a summer vacation. He was interested in geology as much as biology at that point. And he was always a restless theorist, not just a good observer. So having seen these parallel roads, he came up with a theory. They were ancient sea beaches, he concluded, formed when this Glenroy had been a saltwater fjord. The beaches had been raised onto hillsides, he figured, when the entire landscape thereabouts had risen by natural geological uplift. In 1839, same year as his marriage, he published a 50-page paper on Glenroy in a prestigious British journal. It was one of his first big publications, and it turned out to be dead wrong. Not long afterwards, other scientists established the theory of glaciations, which people had not been aware of then, these ancient periods of colder climate during which huge masses of ice had carved and shaped landscapes all over the world. The roads of Glenroy, it turned out, were freshwater, not saltwater beaches, formed when the river had been dammed by ice and the glen filled with a freshwater lake. It might seem like a small distinction to us, but it's a big distinction to geologists. And Darwin was very embarrassed to be so publicly wrong. He later called it a great blunder. And it probably made him wary of committing a similar blunder in biology. The second chilling event occurred in 1844. At this point, he had just drafted a long essay outlining his theory of evolution and his evidence, and he might have published that essay, but he didn't. Why not? Partly, it seems, because another book that was too similar for comfort and too flaky for him to want to be associated with it was published that year. This was something called Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation, which was a popularized mishmash of interesting facts, factoids, and half-baked evolutionary ideas. That book sold really well. People of all sorts read it and talked about it. Queen Victoria, John Stuart Mill, Florence Nightingale. Scientists generally weren't impressed. They denounced the book, careless, inaccurate, maybe amusing, but unpersuasive. And Darwin himself wasn't even amused. He judged this book to be bad on geology, worse still on zoology. And it didn't offer a convincing mechanism for how evolution occurs, nothing like the mechanism he offered. But the fuss over Vestiges seems to have made him even more cautious about coming forward himself. So, 10 more years passed while he digressed into other projects and continued to gather material, evidence, arguments on species transmutation. Then he put the digressions aside and finally started work on what he called his big book about species. After 4 more years, he was halfway through the writing of this big book, a huge manuscript, when he got that fateful letter from Alfred Wallace, and bingo, there was his own theory independently discovered. It seemed that he had waited too long, he was scooped. But as it turned out, he wasn't scooped. That compromise worked out by his powerful scientific friends, a joint announcement at a scientific meeting, saved his priority. He and Wallace were both on the record, but because their presentations to that meeting were brief and cryptic, essentially nobody noticed. That was the summer of 1858, just 150 years ago, right about now. At this point, Darwin did something bold and incautious. He pushed the big book manuscript aside and he started writing again from scratch. He wrote fast now. He didn't bother with footnotes. He included only the best of his factual examples and arguments. He was writing, he told friends, just an abstract of his real book, what we would call the quick and dirty version. Get it written, get it out before some other disaster intervened. Never mind the criticism that it would provoke from his scientific colleagues. Never mind the outrage it would provoke from religious authorities. And never mind the discomfort it would cause to his wife. He charged ahead, producing page after page of what he now called my abominable volume. And it was published the following November that abstract, that abominable volume as On the Origin of Species. Now, The Origin of Species is, I really believe, is a book that every educated person should read. But better still, it's a book you can enjoy reading. It's written in plain language, unlike Newton or Einstein's great works. There's no technical terminology, no mathematics. It's just the voice of this earnest, unassuming Englishman telling the world's most amazing story. And it contains, amid all the rest, one very interesting chapter. That's chapter 6, titled Difficulties on Theory. This is where Darwin argues against himself, challenging his own theory with every criticism he can imagine. Criticisms such as the absence of so-called missing links, or the apparently impossible to evolve complexity of some structures, like the human eye. About those criticisms, he himself says, "Some of them are so grave that to this day I cannot reflect on them without being staggered." Honest. "But to the best of my judgment, the greater number are only apparent, and those that are real are not, I think, fatal to my theory." Years later, in a private autobiography he wrote for his family, he described the method he had used to gather material for this one crucial chapter. He had a golden rule. The rule was that whenever he came across a fact or an argument that seemed to cast his big idea into doubt, he would, quote, "make a memorandum of it without fail and at once. For I had found by experience that such facts and thoughts were far more apt to escape from the memory than favorable ones." That's a habit of pragmatic honesty. Seek out the best criticisms, write them down so you don't forget them conveniently, and address them preemptively. Owing to this habit, he added, very few objections were raised against my views which I had not at least noticed and attempted to answer. The evidence is there in chapter 6 of The Origin. It shows how deeply he cared about understanding the world, not just promoting a theory. The rigorousness of his personal honesty rings out in his autobiography, which was the one book he ever wrote without intending to publish it. He was speaking to his family in that manuscript, but he was speaking candidly, saying things that his wife in particular wouldn't have wanted to hear. The most incautious statements were the ones about religion and the idea of human immortality and his own departure from Christianity. He had given serious attention to the questions of religious belief. In fact, he had read more on the subject and more diversely than most of us ever do. Philosophical works, books by Hume and Locke, spiritual memoirs, books such as James Martineau's Rationale of Religious Inquiry. Gradually, he weighed it all against what his own senses and his own brain told him. Thus, disbelief crept over me at a very slow rate, but was at last complete, he wrote. He wrote, "The rate was so slow that I felt no distress, and have never since doubted, even for a single second, that my conclusion was correct." Close quote. But there was something else he never did. He never tried to persuade other people that they shouldn't believe the Christian tenets of faith. He simply stopped believing them himself. This was a lonely position for him, I think. But it was one about which he had great intellectual clarity. Darwin lived to the age of 73. His marriage and his family were central to his existence. At least, they were central to his personal existence. The center of his existence as a scientist was elsewhere. It was that big theory of his, evolution by natural selection. and his vision of the connectedness of all living things. Heart disease is what eventually took him down. In the spring of 1882, he went into a really bad decline. His wife and 3 of his children gathered around. He suffered terrible pain and nausea. He retched blood until his long white beard was sticky and red. He told his wife how much he loved her. And near the end, he said, "I am not the least afraid to die." He said this, as far as I can figure, for 2 reasons. First, because he recognized that since he was notoriously an unbeliever, people would want to know. The second reason he said it is simpler. He said it because it was true. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.